The old man rode into town at sunset, the same town he once burned to the ground. 30 years had passed. But some ghosts never grow old. The desert wind carried dust through the empty street as the old rider crossed beneath the town's crooked wooden sign, Red Hollow. The letters were newer than the man remembered. The town itself, WAS, and single. Quotes, T. Red Hollow sat between two dry ridges and a thin, stubborn river that refused to die. From a distance it looked peaceful rows of weathered buildings. A quiet saloon, a blacksmith's shop, and a church that leaned slightly to one side as if tired of standing. But to the man on horseback, it looked like a graveyard. He slowed his horse to a careful walk. Boots tapped against the wooden boardwalk. A door creaked somewhere. Someone inside the saloon stopped talking. People always recognized trouble. When it rode into town, the rider was old now. His beard was gray, his coat faded from years of dust and sun. One hand rested loosely near the revolver at his hip, not from purpose but from habit carved into muscle long ago. His name was Elias Crow. 30 years earlier, people had spoken that name like a warning. Back then, Crow rode with a gang that left smoke and silence behind them. Banks, stagecoaches, ranchosny things that stood in their path. But one night had carved his name deeper than any robbery. Red Hollow. It had been a smaller town then. Poor, quiet, forgettable Crow. And his gang arrived in the middle of the night, looking for money hidden in the local bank. When the town resisted, the night turned violent. A fire started. Shots echoed through the streets. By morning, half the town was ash, and 3 men lay dead. Crow rode away with the others, leaving smoke twisting into the sky behind him. He never came back until now. The horse stopped in front of the saloon. Crow looked at the buildings, the streets, the windows, where shadows moved carefully behind curtains. 30 years had passed, but towns like Red Hollow had long memories, and the man who destroyed it had just come home. 30 years earlier, Elias Crow wasn't an old man searching for peace. He was a young gun with a fast trigger and nothing left to lose. Crow had been born on a dying ranch somewhere north of the Pecos River. His father worked himself into the ground, chasing rain that never came. His mother died when Elias was 12. By 15, the ranch was gone, and the boy had learned a simple truth about the frontier. The world didn't care whether you lived or died. For a while he tried honest work. He shoveled coal for a railroad crew, drove cattle across dry plains, and slept in barns when winter rolled in. But honest work paid slow, and the frontier moved fast. The first time Crow pulled a gun was outside a gambling hall in Abilene. A drunk ranch hand tried to cheat him out of his last dollar. The argument lasted less than a minute. The gunshot lasted even less. After that night, Crow understood something else about the West. Fear paid better than honesty. It wasn't long before he fell in with men who believed the same thing. The gang was led by a cold-eyed outlaw named Victor Hawley. Hawley wasn't loud like most bandits. He spoke calmly, almost politely, but people listened because they knew that quiet men were the most dangerous. Under Hale's leadership, the gang became efficient. They robbed stagecoaches, moving silver from mining towns. They hit isolated banks, where the law arrived too late to matter. They moved quickly, leaving towns confused and afraid, long after the dust settled. Crow proved himself early. He was faster than most men, and colder than he looked. So he became Hale's most trusted gun. But there was one job that changed everything. Red Hollow. Victor Hawley had heard rumors about money being stored in the small-town bank. A rancher was expected to deposit a year's worth of cattle prods money than the town had ever seen. Hawley decided to take it. The gang rode into Red Hollow just after midnight. At first, the plan moved quietly. Two men watched the streets while Hallie and Crow forced the banker from his home and marched him to the office vault. But something went wrong. A ranch hand spotted them. The alarm spread through town faster than anyone expected. Lights flickered on in windows. The shotgun blasted from somewhere down the street. Horses panicked in their hitching posts. The quiet robbery turned into chaos. Crow remembered the moment clearly. A lantern crashed against the wooden porch of the bank during the gunfight. The oil spilled. The flames spread. Within minutes, fire was crawling across the dry timber buildings. People ran through the streets, shouting. Smoke rolled upward as gunshots cracked through the darkness. Crow fired again and again, barely thinking. When it was over, 3 townsmen lay dead in the dirt. Half the street burned until dawn. Victor Hawley ordered the gang to ride before the law arrived. They disappeared into the desert with the stolen money. Behind them, Red Hollow smoldered in silence. For years afterward, Crow told himself the fire hadn't been his fault. That it was just another job gone wrong. But time has a strange way of peeling back the lies men tell themselves. Then, as the decades passed, the memory of that burning town followed him like a shadow that never faded. Inside the saloon, the air felt heavier than the desert heat outside. Elias Crow stepped through the swinging doors slowly, as if the past itself might be waiting on the other side. The room went quiet, not the ordinary silence of strangers sizing each other up. This was something colder. Men at the bar stopped mid-drink. A card game froze in place. Even the piano player let the final note die beneath his fingers. Crow removed his hat and brushed the dust from it. No one greeted him. No one asked what he wanted. They were studying him. Some of the older faces looked familiar. 30 years had carved deep lines into them, but Crow recognized the same eyes that once watched their town. Burn. One man at the bar leaned toward another and whispered something. Crow didn't hear the words. He didn't need to. The bartender approached cautiously. "You passing through?" the man asked. Crow placed a few coins on the counter. "Whiskey." The bartender didn't pour it immediately. Instead, he studied Crow's face longer than necessary. Then something shifted in his expression. Recognition, slow and uncomfortable. "You're Crow," the bartender muttered. The name moved through the room like a cold draft chairs creaked. Someone's hand rested near a revolver. Crow took the whiskey glass and drank half of it in one swallow. "I figured some folks might still remember," he said quietly. A rough voice spoke from the far corner of the room. "We remember." Crow turned his head. An older rancher stood up from a table, his movements stiff but determined. The man's left arm hung uselessly at his side. Crow recognized him immediately. Thomas Weller. 30 years ago, Weller had been one of the men who tried to stop the gang that night. Crow remembered the shotgun blast that shattered the man's shoulder. "You burned half this town," Weller said. Asterisk. Crow didn't argue. Another man spoke from near the door. "My brother died that night." "And my father," someone else added. The room filled with quiet anger that had been waiting decades for a reason to return. Crow set the glass down. "I didn't come back for trouble." Weller laughed, one short and bitter. "That's funny," he said, "because trouble seems to follow you everywhere." Crow's eyes moved slowly around the room. Some of the men looked ready to draw their guns. Others looked afraid. But most of them looked like people who had waited a long time for this exact moment. Crow rested his hands on the bar. "I know what happened here," he said. "You think 30 years makes that disappear?" Weller replied. "No," Crow said. I came back because it doesn't. Outside, the wind pushed dust across the empty street. Inside the saloon, the tension thickened. Crow had returned to the town he destroyed, and Red Hollow was beginning to decide what to do with him. The saloon door creaked open behind Elias Crow. Cold evening light spilled across the wooden floor. For a moment, no one moved. Then a young man stepped inside. He couldn't have been older than 20. His coat was clean, his revolver new, and his eyes carried the kind of anger that hadn't yet learned patience. Crow noticed the resemblance. Immediately the shape of the jaw, the stubborn eyes. Thomas Weller noticed it too. "My son," the old rancher said quietly. The young man walked forward, stopping in the middle of the room. His hand hovered close to the grip of his revolver. "You're Elias Crow," he said. Crow nodded once. The young man studied him carefully, almost confused. "You don't look like the man I imagined." Crow said nothing. "I grew up hearing about you," the young man continued. "The night you and your gang burned this town. The men you killed." The room had gone completely silent now. Crow could feel every eye watching. "My name is Daniel Weller," the young man said. Crow looked at him, then slowly glanced toward the older man with the damaged arm. Thomas Weller. The memory struck him. Like a sudden wind. That shotgun blast. That fire. Crow exhaled slowly. "You came to kill me," he said. Daniel didn't deny it. "I waited a long time for you to come back." Crow studied the young man's stance. His hand was steady, but there was tension in his shoulders. Not fear, expectation. The kind of expectation that came from a lifetime of stories about revenge. Crow stepped away from the bar and into the center of the room. Every man inside the saloon leaned forward slightly. Daniel Weller's hand tightened on his revolver. Crow stopped a few steps away, then, slowly, deliberately, he unbuckled his gun belt. The leather slid loose from his waist. Crow let the belt fall to the wooden floor. The heavy revolver landed with a dull thud. Gasps moved through the room. Crow raised his empty hands. "If killing me settles the debt," he said quietly, "then do it." Daniel stared at him. For the first time since he entered the saloon, the certainty in his eyes began to crack. The revolver lay on the floor. Between them, a weapon that had decided the fate of many men, now useless in the dust. Daniel Weller stared at Elias Crow, confused by something he had never expected. The stories had always been simple. Elias Crow was a monster, a ruthless outlaw who burned a town and rode away, laughing. But the man standing in front of him didn't look like that legend. He looked tired, old, and strangely calm. "You think dropping your gun fixes anything?" Daniel said, his voice sharp, but uncertain. Crow shook his head slowly. "No." The words settled heavily in the room. "Nothing fixes what happened here." "Behind Daniel," someone muttered angrily. Another man stepped closer to the door, ready in case things turned violent. Thomas Weller watched carefully from the corner, his damaged arm resting against his chest. Crow continued speaking. "I spent 30 years riding from town to town," he said, "trying to outrun that night." His voice carried no drama, no attempt to impress anyone, just a quiet truth. "At first I told myself it wasn't my fault. That fires start during gunfights, that men die in robberies." He paused. "But the older I got, the harder those lies became to believe." The saloon remained silent. Crow looked around the room. "I heard what happened after we left," he continued. "Families losing homes, businesses gone. 3 graves dug before sunrise." He looked directly at Thomas Weller. "And men who carried scars long after the smoke cleared." Weller's expression hardened, But he didn't interrupt. Crow turned back to Daniel. I'm not here to beg forgiveness. Daniel's finger rested near the trigger. Then why come back? He demanded. Crow glanced toward the window where the fading sunlight painted long shadows across the street. Because men like me don't get peace, he said quietly. We either keep running, or we face what we did. Daniel felt something shifting inside him. Anger had always been easy. Hatred had always been simple. But this moment was different. The man he came to kill wasn't fighting, wasn't defending himself. He was offering his life, like a debt long overdue. Behind Daniel, someone spoke. Just shoot him. Another voice joined in. Towns waited long enough. The room began to murmur with agreement. Daniel's grip tightened. Crow remained still. Hands raised, eyes steady. Outside, the sun dipped lower behind the ridges. Red Hollow had waited 30 years for justice, and now the decision rested in the hands of a man who had never seen the fire. Only the ashes it left behind. Daniel Weller slowly drew his revolver. The metallic sound echoed through the silent saloon like a final warning. Every man in the room watched. Some leaned forward in their chairs, others held their breath. For 30 years. Red Hollow had carried the memory of one night of fire tearing through wooden buildings, of gunshots cutting through the dark, of men dying in the dust. And now the man responsible stood in front of them without a weapon. Elias Crow didn't move. His hands remained raised, his eyes fixed calmly on Daniel. The young man stepped closer. One step, then another. The revolver lifted until it pointed directly at Crow's chest. You expect me to believe you came back just to die? Daniel asked. Crow shook his head slightly. No, he said. I came back because I finally understood something. Daniel's finger rested against the trigger. And what's that? Crow's eyes drifted for a moment toward the window, where the last light of the sun stretched across the empty street. Running doesn't erase what a man has done. His voice was steady, almost tired. For 30 years I kept thinking I could ride far enough, live long enough, and eventually the past would stop following me. He looked back at Daniel, but it doesn't. A chair creaked behind them. Someone shifted nervously. Crow continued. The men I rode with are all gone now, he said. Victor Holly was shot by a bounty hunter 15 years ago. 2 others died in prison. The rest killed each other over stolen money. The room listened. They all died like outlaws, Crow said quietly. Daniel studied him. Then why? Didn't you? Crow took a slow breath. Because I started remembering the faces of the people in this town. The words carried weight. I remembered the man who tried to stop us outside the bank. He nodded toward Thomas Weller. I remembered the people running through the street while the fire spread. Crow paused. And I remembered the men who never stood up again. The silence inside the saloon felt almost unbearable now. Crow lowered his hands slightly, but kept them open. If killing me helps this town bury that night, he said, then I won't stop you. Daniel's hand trembled. Just slightly. For his entire life, he had imagined this moment. The outlaw standing in front of him. The gunshot that would settle the past. But something felt wrong. The man in front of him wasn't the legend he had hated. He was just an old man carrying 30 years of regret. Do it, someone in the room whispered. Finish it. Daniel's jaw tightened. The revolver remained steady. But the certainty inside him was fading. Crow watched him calmly. I won't draw on you, he said. Not today. The young man stared into the outlaw's eyes. And suddenly Daniel realized something terrifying. The man he came to kill had already faced the hardest part. Coming back. Now the weight of that decision had shifted. It belonged to Daniel. Daniel Weller stood frozen in the center of the saloon. The revolver in his hand suddenly felt heavier than it had a moment ago. Across from him, Elias Crow waited, not pleading, not running, just waiting. The room seemed to shrink around them. Every man in Red Hollow watched a young rancher who had carried their anger for years. Daniel thought about the stories he grew up hearing, the night of fire, the men who died, the homes that turned to ash. He remembered his father's damaged arm, the quiet bitterness that lived behind his old man's eyes whenever Red Hollow's past was mentioned. For years, Daniel had believed revenge would bring something close to peace. But now, staring at the gray-haired outlaw before him, the idea fell. Hollow. Crow didn't look like a monster. He looked like a man who had already punished himself, longer than any bullet could. Daniel slowly exhaled, then lowered the gun. The sound of the hammer easing forward was softer than a whisper. A ripple moved through the room. Some men shifted angrily. Others seemed strangely relieved. Daniel slid the revolver back into its holster. "No," he said quietly. The word hung in the air. Crow studied him carefully. "You sure about that, son?" Thomas Weller asked from the corner. Daniel turned to his father. "You told me something once," Daniel said. "You said that night already took enough from this town." Thomas didn't respond. Daniel looked back at Crow. "If we kill him now, that fire still wins." The saloon fell silent again. Crow bent down slowly and picked up his gun belt from the floor. But instead of strapping it on, he carried it in his hand. "I won't stay long," he said. No one tried to stop him as he walked toward the door. Outside, the desert night had begun to settle over Red Hollow. Crow mounted his horse and took one last look at the town he once destroyed. Then he rode into the darkness, and this time, the past did not follow. Some men spend their lives running from what they've done. Others eventually turn around and face it. Redemption isn't about erasing the past. It's about accepting its weight and choosing what kind of man you become afterward. If you enjoy dark frontier legends and stories of justice, revenge, and redemption, subscribe to Whispers of the West and ride with us into the forgotten shadows of the frontier.